She had 4 match points, 4 separate chances to end it, and she let every single one slip through her fingers. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why a rematch nobody circled on their calendar might turn into the most tension-filled contest of this entire Wimbledon fortnight. Here's the setup. 2 players. One, a rising force from the Philippines, the other, a young Australian with a game still finding its shape, keep landing on opposite sides of the net at the worst possible moments for each other. Every time they meet, something goes sideways. A rout turns into a nail-biter. A guaranteed win turns into a nightmare. So, when the Wimbledon draw paired them again, a full year after their first collision, longtime fans didn't see a routine second-round matchup. They saw unfinished business. The real question hanging over center court isn't who's ranked higher right now. It's whether history repeats itself or whether one of them has finally exorcised it. Picture this moment, paraphrased from how it was later described, standing 2 points from the biggest title of her career, everything suddenly slipping away, point by agonizing point, and afterward admitting she genuinely couldn't explain how it happened. That's roughly how one of these 2 players described the collapse that started this whole rivalry. Imagine building a lead that big, feeling the trophy practically in your hands, and then watching it evaporate in real time. What would that do to you walking into the next meeting? Would you carry it quietly, or would it show up in your shot selection the moment things got tight again? To understand why this matchup carries so much weight, rewind to last June, a modest grass court tournament, the kind most casual fans skip right past in the schedule. Nobody outside hardcore tennis circles was paying close attention, but for the Filipina player, ranked well outside the top 60 at the time, this was a breakthrough in real time. She tore through the draw with the kind of hunger that only comes from having something to prove, and she became the first player from her country ever to reach a WTA Tour-level final. That's not a small footnote. That's history, carried by a 21-year-old training thousands of miles from home, representing an entire nation on her shoulders every time she stepped onto the court. Across the net in the final stood a teenager from Australia, just 19 at the time, with raw talent that hadn't quite clicked into form yet, but with nerves, as it turned out, that were sturdier than anyone expected. Nobody in the stands that day knew they were watching the opening chapter of something that would still be unresolved a full year later. Nobody could have known that this obscure final would end up defining how both of their careers were talked about for the next 12 months. Now let's get into what actually happened, because the details matter here. The Filipina player dropped the opening set, then flipped the match completely, dominating the second set so thoroughly it looked essentially decided, 6-1, a scoreline that basically screams the match is over. She then found herself serving for the championship in a deciding set tiebreak. This was the moment, right there. And then it all unraveled. Championship point number 1, saved. Championship point number 2, saved. A third chance came and went. A fourth followed it into the void. 4 separate opportunities to close out the biggest win of her career, and 4 times her teenage opponent refused to let the door shut. Somehow, improbably, the tiebreak swung the other way entirely, ending 12 points to 10, and the trophy went to the player who'd been on the ropes the whole final. Can you imagine having match point 4 separate times and still walking away empty-handed? That's not a typical loss. That's the kind of result that lodges itself somewhere in the back of your mind and just waits, quietly, for the next time you're in a similar spot. Think about the psychology of that for a second. It's one thing to lose a close match where the outcome feels like a coin flip the entire way through. It's another thing entirely to dominate for the better part of 2 sets, to feel the finish line practically underneath your feet, and then to watch a teenager who, by all accounts, shouldn't have had the composure for that moment, simply refuse to go away. 4 championship points isn't a small margin. It's 4 separate instances where the match was, by any reasonable measure, over, and 4 separate times it wasn't. What does that do to a competitor's relationship with closing matches out? Does it make her tighten up the next time she's in a similar spot? Or does it eventually forge something tougher? So how did the tennis world react once the dust settled? Commentary at the time framed it less as an upset and more as a statement of resilience. Pundits kept circling back to how the teenager had somehow found composure exactly when logic said she should have folded. Fans on social media were split. Some praised the young Australian's nerve under pressure, calling it one of the gutsiest comebacks of the season. Others pointed out, not unkindly, that the Filipina player had essentially handed away a career-defining trophy. One widely shared post at the time noted that missing 4 championship points in a row wasn't bad luck. It was a mental hurdle that would need to be dealt with eventually. That framing stuck. For months afterward, whenever her name came up in previews, that collapse got mentioned in the same breath as her talent. It became the asterisk next to an otherwise remarkable breakout season. Was that fair to her? Maybe not entirely, but that's how narratives work in this sport. One dramatic afternoon can end up following a player around far longer than the moment itself actually lasted. And here's the thing that made it sting even more in hindsight. Neither player had much time to simply move past it and forget. They were both still building their careers in real time, both still climbing rankings, both still crossing paths on the same tour, at many of the same tournaments, week after week. There was no quiet retirement into obscurity for either of them, where the loss and the win could just fade into old highlight reels. Instead, it sat there, unresolved, while both of their careers kept evolving in wildly different directions over the following 12 months. One of them would rise. The other would fall apart entirely before finding one flicker of something resembling her old form. And that's exactly where this story gets interesting. Now, fast forward exactly 1 year. Same country, same grass, but an entirely different stage. This time, it's Wimbledon, and the stakes have multiplied. The Filipino player arrives seeded for the first time ever at this tournament, a career high ranking in the low 30s, and genuinely the best grass court form of her life behind her. Let's talk about how she actually got here, because it wasn't a fluke. She opened the grass swing by winning a smaller title outright, grinding through a tense 3-set final that tested her nerve in exactly the kind of tight moments that used to be a question mark for her game. From there, she ran into a buzzsaw of an opponent at a bigger event and lost in straight sets, a result that, on paper, looked like a real red flag heading into the bigger tournaments. But what happened next completely reframed that loss. At a WTA 500 event, she delivered the 2 best consecutive wins of her entire season, beating a top 50 ranked opponent and then a top 10 opponent back-to-back, something she had never managed on grass before that week. That's not incremental progress, that's a statement. She eventually lost in the semifinal of that event and then suffered an early exit at her very next tournament. And that inconsistency actually tells us something meaningful about where she stands right now. Her ceiling on this surface is legitimately elite, capable of trading blows with the very best players alive and coming out on top. But her floor can still drop out from under her without warning, specifically against opponents who disrupt her rhythm instead of feeding into it. Players who hit with pace and structure give her something to counter and redirect. Players who scramble, who slow things down, who refuse to give her a clean ball to attack, those are the players who smother her game before it ever gets rolling. So where does her Wimbledon rival fall on that spectrum? That's really the tactical heartbeat of everything about to unfold on center court. In her opening match at this Wimbledon, she looked every bit like a player who belongs on this surface, dismantling her first-round opponent in barely over an hour, cracking well over 20 clean winners, landing the vast majority of her net approaches, and facing only 2 break points the entire match, saving both of them without much visible stress. It wasn't reckless swing for the fences aggression either. It was calculated, controlled aggression, the kind that comes from a player who trusts exactly where each point is headed and isn't second-guessing herself mid-rally. Her signature left-handed serve kept dragging her opponent wide again and again on the advantage side, and whenever the return floated back short, she was already moving forward to finish things off at the net.
That serve plus one pattern is the foundation of her entire grass court identity right now, and at the moment, it's humming beautifully. Doesn't that make you wonder just how far this run could actually go if nothing derails it?
Now, flip over to her opponent's side of the draw, because the numbers here tell a much starker, much grimmer story. Heading into this tournament, the Australians' record for the entire season sat at just 2 wins against 13 losses. She's won barely 15% of her matches all year. Her ranking has collapsed from a career high in the high 20s back in February all the way down into the high 80s by the time this Wimbledon draw came out. An injury sidelined her for 2 full months after a tournament earlier in the year, and when she finally returned to competition, nothing clicked back into place. First-round exit after first-round exit followed, including, painfully, right back at the same tournament where she'd won the title the year before. Her serve, which was never a dominant weapon to begin with, has essentially fallen apart statistically. She's winning under half of her service games this season, averaging fewer than 1.5 aces per match, with a first serve speed that ranks near the very bottom of the entire tour. On paper, this is a player in genuine freefall. And yet, she just won a 3-set battle against a legendary former champion, making her long-awaited return to singles tennis, right there on center court, 1 day before this rematch. Not with some flawless, dominant, vintage performance, not with a miracle serving clinic that suddenly erased months of poor form. She won because she simply refused to stop competing. She took the opening set comfortably, dropped a brutally tight second set tiebreak when her legendary opponent flashed some of the power everyone remembered from her prime, and then broke serve 3 times in the deciding set to close the match out. She chased down nearly everything. She made her opponent hit 1 extra shot on almost every single point of that match, over and over, wearing her down point by point rather than overpowering her outright.
So here's what that stunning win actually tells us heading into this next match, and what it very deliberately does not tell us. What it tells us is that whatever psychological weight had been crushing her throughout that brutal losing streak, the simple act of walking onto the biggest court in tennis and beating a multiple Grand Slam champion, even one 4 decades into her career and years removed from competitive tennis, has handed her something no amount of quiet practice sessions or pep talks from her team ever could. Real, earned momentum, forged directly in the fire of survival rather than manufactured in a training block somewhere. She admitted afterward in a strikingly honest post-match interview that she barely slept the night before, that her legs felt shaky and unreliable even during her pre-match warm-up, and that she genuinely couldn't explain how she managed to find her footing once the match actually began. That kind of raw disorientation, followed immediately by a gritty 3-set win, suggests a player who stumbled into something in the middle of the fight, rather than someone who walked out onto the court already possessing it beforehand. So the real question becomes whether she can summon that same version of herself again, just about 48 hours later, against a completely different kind of opponent, one who is fresher, sharper, and significantly more dangerous than the legend she'd just faced. And here's what that emotional win from the day before very specifically doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us that she's actually fixed the deeper structural problems that have haunted her entire season. Her opponent in that match was playing her first competitive singles match in nearly 4 years. Her movement was visibly limited throughout. Her court coverage, while occasionally brilliant in isolated flashes reminiscent of her prime, faded noticeably as the match wore on into the 3rd set. The Australians' grinding baseline game worked in that specific instance because she was up against someone who simply couldn't sustain relentless pressure over long rallies anymore, not because her own underlying issues had suddenly resolved themselves overnight.
Her opponent, meanwhile, is 21 years old, has been grinding through competitive tour-level matches every single week for months on end without pause, and hits the ball with considerably more consistent pace off the ground than what was coming off her legendary opponent's racket the day before. The raw speed generated off that lefty forehand and that distinctive lefty serve is going to be noticeably faster and far more relentless than anything the Australian faced during that emotional center court upset. Doesn't that change the entire equation? A gutsy comeback against a limited, rusty legend is one thing. Surviving the same kind of pressure against a fully in-form, in-rhythm, top 30 player who's been playing lights-out tennis for weeks is an entirely different mountain to climb. Tactically speaking, this matchup appears to favor the Filipina player on nearly every measurable front you could point to. She's taller by a noticeable margin, which on this surface translates into extra reach and leverage on both her serve and her overhead. She hits the ball flatter than most of her peers, which on grass means her shots stay lower and skid through the court faster than a heavier topspin-based game ever could. Her left-handed serve creates awkward angles that right-handed opponents consistently struggle to neutralize, especially out wide on the advantage court, where she can either swing the ball away from the body entirely or jam it straight into her opponent's hip with almost no warning. Her Australian rival has historically been a solid, capable returner of serve, but throughout this entire season, she's struggled badly to generate any real pressure, even against fairly average servers, and her upcoming opponent is anything but an average server right now.
Her delivery isn't a dominant first strike weapon in the same explosive way that some of the tour's biggest servers can boast, but it's awkward, well-placed, and precise enough to consistently draw short, weak returns, or simply steal free points outright on this particular surface. But here's exactly where the ghost of that first meeting a year ago comes creeping right back into the conversation, because the numbers said she should have won that final too. She was statistically the better player for the vast majority of that match. She dominated the second set so completely that it genuinely looked like her opponent had nothing left in the tank to offer. And then, somehow, her opponent found something extra. She found a way to absorb relentless pressure, to redirect it right back across the net, to make her feel the full, crushing weight of trying to close out a match that she was supposed to have already comfortably won. Doesn't that history alone deserve to weigh on some part of her mind, even now, even with everything else stacked so heavily in her favor? Her opponent's greatest strength was never really one specific shot or one particularly clever tactical pattern. It's her almost stubborn, almost irrational capacity to simply stay alive in matches that she appears, by every reasonable measure, to be losing. Her ability to stretch out rallies, to force her opponent into hitting one more shot than they ever wanted to hit. To make the finish line feel just a little further away than it actually is in reality. On grass, where points are naturally shorter and the margin for that kind of grinding resistance is considerably narrower than on clay or hard courts, this particular quality becomes less reliable. But it doesn't simply vanish into thin air, either. Her compact, well-timed backhand might genuinely be the single shot that keeps her competitive in this fight, disguised well enough that she can go cross-court or down the line without tipping her opponent off in advance. If she can find a way to neutralize those wide serves, either by stepping around them aggressively to attack with her forehand, or by slicing her backhand return, low and deep, to disrupt her opponent's forward momentum into the net, she genuinely has a real chance to drag rallies into uncomfortable territory. And her opponent, for all of her considerable strengths on this surface, does not particularly enjoy being pulled into extended baseline exchanges out here. She's at her most dangerous when a point is moving forward with purpose, when she's dictating with her first 2 or 3 shots and finishing things decisively at the net. Every single rally that stretches out past 7 or 8 shots is terrain that starts tilting, at least incrementally, in her opponent's favor rather than her own. Ultimately, the serve is probably going to decide this entire contest, And here, the Filipina player holds a genuinely massive statistical edge. Her opponent's service numbers this year are frankly borderline alarming. Winning under half of her service games means she's getting broken almost every other single time she steps up to the baseline. And she's about to face a player whose return game has been sharpened relentlessly by months of high-level brass court tennis, and whose left-handed returns naturally generate angles that pull servers straight out of their comfort zone. If an early break arrives, this match could very easily follow the exact same efficient script as her dominant first-round win. But her opponent has been here afore. Specifically, she's been in this exact position, heavily expected to lose to this exact player, and somehow found a way not to. And that psychological residue cuts in both directions simultaneously, which is really what makes this whole situation so genuinely unpredictable. For the underdog, it's tangible, lived proof that she can survive her rival's very best tennis and still find a way to win precisely when the pressure reaches its absolute peak. For the favorite, it's a memory that could plant just enough hesitation at exactly the wrong moment, deep in a tight set, when the match seems all but decided. Picture it happening again. A commanding lead built early, a break of serve banked in the second set, and then, slowly, point by relentless point, her opponent starts chipping away at the margin. Does she tighten up when that happens? Does the memory of those 4 unconverted championship points come creeping back into her racket hand at the worst conceivable moment? Or has this entire year of growth since that painful final, the wins over 2 top 10 opponents, the achievement of finally becoming a seeded player at a Grand Slam, given her enough armor, enough hard-won belief to close the door for good this time around? And then there's the context surrounding the match itself, which honestly matters more than most casual viewers tend to give it credit for. Her opponent just spent well over 2 hours locked in a physically and emotionally draining 3-set battle against a legendary former champion. The adrenaline running through a match like that is genuinely extraordinary. The kind of chemical rush that can carry a competitor through an entire day, and then leave them completely hollowed out once it finally wears off. The typical turnaround window between matches at this tournament runs somewhere around 48 hours, which is enough time to recover physically, sure, but maybe not nearly enough time to recover emotionally.